Hey guys, what's up? My name is Karis. Welcome to Fix Your Shitty Movement. Today we're looking at the Romanian deadlift, which is a hip hinge. We've talked about the hip hinge before, but it's the most commonly poorly done movement consistently that I see in people who actually have either potential to be really strong or who are already strong but could potentially be even stronger if they could master the hip hinge. Why does the hip hinge matter? Because it's what a deadlift is. A deadlift is a hip hinge, and it doesn't matter if it's sumo or conventional, they're both hip hinges. Hence, Romanian deadlift is right in the title. So we've talked about the hip hinge before, and hopefully you'll remember that if your hip is fully extended, right, your pubic bone and hip bones are on the same vertical plane, right? This is anterior tilt. This is neutral, this is posterior tilt, and that is the hip bones in relation to the pubic bone. So we want neutral. In a hip hinge, you will literally bend your hips, which will also involve some degree of knee flexion to assist with that, and hip extension. But in both positions, your pelvis stays neutral, okay? So why do we want the knees to bend slightly? Because if you keep your knees locked, your hip hinge is very limited. So the hip hinge is going to be defined by how far you can move your hips back, okay? So, you might be moving this back too, but you can see that that's not actually the hips that are moving back anymore, right? So the shins rather are in a fixed position, and you are rotating essentially around your knee joint, your patella. So you can see also that when I'm doing that, my hips will move in just straight back, right? There's no downward movement of them. You can see that if there is any downward movement, the knees move forward. Again, breaking that rule with the vertical shin. So that makes it a squat, and that's what makes it a squat. And remember that the low bar squat, in particular, although I teach the squats all as starting with a hip hinge, they start with a hip hinge and then come down into a squat, as we've talked about before. So again, that just speaks to the importance of the hip hinge and your understanding of it. So the Romanian deadlift is, probably as most people will recognize it, done with a barbell. And I love it with the barbell because I really like the way that you get tactile feedback from the bar that will allow you to gauge where your body is in space, which is, especially as a beginner learning the hip hinge, one of the areas that can be the most challenging to learn. So I have everything set up like super close to this thing because the profile is really going to tell you the most about whether or not you're in a hip hinge. Again, it's because we want that hips back, hips forward, and no movement of the shin. So actually the next two Fix Your Shitty movements after this one are also gonna look at the hip hinge. We're gonna look at the barbell good morning, 3 variations of the barbell good morning next time. So definitely stay tuned for that because that is also a very butchered exercise and by extension, a very avoided exercise because of the way that it can get into your back. But I would say that's exactly why you should be doing it. It's just a signal that you're not doing something correctly, and it's like free training. Like body's saying, hey, motherfucker, I don't like that. And you're just like, man, I fucking hate this good morning. No, like, okay, well maybe I should try to strategize and figure out why my back is hurting. Generally in the hip hinge, if you experience back pain, the number one reason is losing neutral of your pelvis. So more often than not, that's instead of hinging or bending your hips back, right? You can see fairly clearly there, you're actually tilting your pelvis, right? And even just doing that, I've been demonstrating that a lot lately, and my back doesn't fucking like it because, yeah, it's just like really overacting these or overactivating these muscles, right? Particularly like QL, but by doing that too, you can see how you took my spine from this long neutral position, right? Because my spine should not be moving position to now a compressed one. I'm compressing this area. And the further back my hips move, the more it compresses my spine. So you can take that into your deadlift, good morning, kettlebell swing, all that shit. All of those things that are hip hinges, that is the most common reason why it gets into people's backs. Even glute ham raises, any hamstring exercise. I'm gonna get into hamstring exercises another time, although the Romanian deadlift, well, the hamstrings are a big player in all those exercises I just mentioned, because again, of the way that they assist in hip flexion or the hip hinge, okay? So with the Romanian deadlift, I have seen it taught multiple different ways, so please don't be triggered if this is not the way that you've been taught it, because I've seen like world-class coaches teaching the RDL in a way that I don't agree with, and I don't agree with because of the way that I have learned it and the way that I utilize it in teaching a ton of movements in the toolbox, so to speak. So with the Romanian deadlift, a lot of times what I see is people going beyond a hip hinge. And so they will actually like tap the ground and come back up. And that would be different from a conventional deadlift, because you're trying to keep the backs of your knees higher, okay? So I'll show you what a conventional deadlift looks like. Again, it's helpful to see the profile because I want you to pay attention to my shins. So setting up for the conventional deadlift, sitting back, and see, I'm able to get my hips down, but I'm still not allowing my shins to move forward. Why is this a deadlift? Because I'm using the bar as counterweight. So if I didn't have the bar, it'd be very difficult for me to hold that position. So although my hips are moving down, kind of, yeah, and you are getting a lot more quad than you would in like a Romanian deadlift. It's again because it's still a hip hinge, because you're keeping your shins relatively vertical, right, relative to the individual. There's always going to be some deviation, or sometimes I should say, but also again, the way that you are picking it up from the floor. So when you see someone down here with really straight legs, which is the way that the deadlift is taught most commonly in group classes, that's a stiff-legged deadlift. And a stiff-legged deadlift involves a lot more lower back and hamstring because of the way that the knees are not fully locked out, but pretty damn close. And like I told you earlier, if your hips stop moving, it no longer becomes a hip hinge. And remember, when you see the hip hinge, right, hip flexion, hip extension, primary hip extenders, the glutes. So when you're keeping your glutes only partially engaged, it becomes a hamstring dominant exercise. And so stiff-legged deadlifts aren't bad, they're just not really useful unless you're training for aesthetic reasons. So a lot of bodybuilders utilize the stiff-legged deadlift because of the way that it can develop your hamstrings. I'm told anyway. I know nothing about bodybuilding. I don't particularly like the stiff-legged deadlift. I don't see any purpose for it. You can't use as much weight, and I don't like anything that enforces a bad hip hinge pattern. And that's really what my clients are looking for. They want to improve generally squat, bench, deadlift, or things within that family. So I see no reason at all to teach the stiff-legged deadlift, okay? So I know there's a lot of information coming at you, but the hip hinge is tricky, and this is one that trips a lot of people up. So I'm hoping that you are mentally taking notes on a lot of these cues or these things to look for in your own body that will let you decide, is this a hip hinge? Is this a stiff-legged deadlift? Is this a conventional deadlift? Is this a squat? Because there's a lot of confusion around what all of those things are and the relationship to each other. So now, the Romanian deadlift. The Romanian deadlift is essentially the top half of a conventional deadlift. So if you're going purely hip hinge, regardless of your flexibility, the bar should come right below your kneecaps. And remember, if you go any lower than that, your hips aren't really moving back anymore. You might feel a big stretch in the glutes, but you're also feeling a big stretch in the hamstrings. And that's not really what we're going for. Again, that's how you can identify that as a stiff-legged deadlift. So if it feels like your hamstrings are gonna snap, it's likely that you are keeping your knees a little too locked out. So again, I'm gonna come down in the conventional deadlift, stand up all the way. So remember, my inappropriate cue last week was to fuck the bar. Very important. We want to get stacked over our feet. So shoulders are over the pelvis, pelvis over the knees, and knees over the ankles, okay? So then the bar is up against my body right now, and I want to keep it there. So I'm going to hinge my hips back, right? And notice I didn't do that by tilting my pelvis. It's neutral, so I'm pulling my low abs up and in, and I hinge back and allow the bar to slide down my thighs. And once it gets to here, right below the knee, stand up and squeeze and fuck the bar again. So you can see that I'm in a figure 4 position at the bottom, or hopefully something close to that. That's also what we look for in the kettlebell swing, or really any hip hinge. You're kind of in a number 4 position, meaning that your chest is higher than your hips and your shins are vertical. So I really see a number 4 when you know that cue was given to me a million years ago. Usually when I use it with people, they're like, what? But hopefully it makes sense to you. Remember, not all cues are going to make sense to you, and that's okay. It's your coach's job to find the cues that do make sense to help you learn the movement. It's not, oh, you're stupid and uncoachable, unless you are stupid and uncoachable, because that does happen. So you can use the bar to your advantage here. If the bar leaves your body, you can see how now I'm moving from my lower back, right? Making it, again, a lower back exercise. Well, I don't even want to say exercise, because honestly, I don't see any reason to be loading your back like that. Even stiff-legged deadlifts will stay close to your body. But you should arrive to the top of the kneecap, and then that's when you kind of sit your hips further back, and then stand up and squeeze. And so I like to have a slower descent, probably like 3 count, and then power up and squeeze. And you never, ever leave a neutral pelvis, and your shins never leave a vertical position. If your knees get in the way of the bar, you see how my hips are moving down? That's a squat, right? So you are no longer hinging, you're no longer sitting straight back, you're actually starting to squat. And that's another way that it can aggravate your back, okay? I said before that one way that you can clean up your form on a lot of movements is actually to add more weight. The Romanian deadlift is one of those movements. Obviously, if you're a newbie, don't fucking do that. Like, you have to kind of practice first. But if you're struggling, you might be amazed that just the bar or even a dowel can actually hinder you from feeling it, because your body's gonna, you'll get tight by necessity if enough weight is on you. And again, just kind of slowly work up to it. If you're not really sure what the fuck I'm talking about, don't just do it, be smart about it, don't be a moron. One more thing I'm gonna show you guys, and that's why I have you in this corner here. You can think about, you can set yourself up so that you can feel something, your butt touch something. And you want to make sure that it's not so close that you can't feel if, so close or so far that you can't feel if there's deviation in the knees, which is really what's going to determine whether or not you're in a hip hinge anymore. So, sitting up in my deadlift, and you just kind of have to feel out where you are. So I'm going to reach my butt straight back. Oh, perfect. So my butt touched right as the bar arrived right below my knees. You can also use like a heavy bag, something like this. You can use a wall even. Just be really careful about, again, where you position your butt, because sometimes if you have it off just a little bit, it will make you think that you're doing it well, and you aren't. So practice the Romanian deadlift. Don't just ignore it. It's a really powerful accessory movement that strengthens the top half of your deadlift, even if you're a sumo lifter. In fact, I would say even more so, because we should really be working in this plane more if we're always here, like I am. And it's also really, really good for working your grip and your brace. So making sure to take your time, And if you're flexible especially, slow it down, slow it down. My name's Karis.